The 2026 World Cup is happening right now across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The biggest football tournament in the history of the sport. 48 nations, over 100 matches, billions of eyes glued to every whistle. But this video isn't about the players you're watching. This is a video about the players you're not watching. The stars who should be lifting a trophy right now, and instead are sitting at home, staring at a television screen, watching everyone else live their dream. Because the 2026 World Cup has already made history for something nobody expected. It's the most heavily policed tournament FIFA has ever staged. Brand new red card rules. Global suspensions that stretch from Champions League nights all the way to opening day group stage matches. Doping scandals that swallowed entire careers. And even one full country wiped off the qualifying map before a single ball was kicked. All of it colliding at the same time, in the same summer, on the biggest stage in the world. If you're the kind of football fan who wants the real story behind the headlines, not the polished FIFA press release, not the recycled tweet, but the actual mechanics of how a professional footballer loses everything in 90 seconds, this is the video for you. We're about to walk you through the players who thought they were going to the World Cup and the reason each one of them isn't. Some of these stories broke on the opening night. Some of these stories have been quietly ticking for 2 years. And one of them, we can promise you right now, was so shocking that FIFA changed its rulebook because of it. That's not a fan theory. That's the official record. So here's how this works. Case by case. No filler. No hype. We're going to break down every single major footballer who is banned, suspended, ejected, or otherwise blocked from this tournament. And we're going to explain, in plain language, exactly what they did, exactly what FIFA did back to them, and exactly why it matters. Some of these bans happened this month. Some of these bans happened before the tournament even started. And by the time we get to the end of this list, you're going to understand something most casual viewers never will. The 2026 World Cup isn't just being played on the pitch. It's being played inside disciplinary committee rooms in Zurich. And the punishments coming out of those rooms are already more brutal than half the tackles you've seen in the group stage. Now, before we get into the individual cases, one honest promise. We're not giving you the sanitized version. When a player crossed a line, we're telling you exactly what he said, exactly what he did, exactly who saw it, and exactly what the video review caught. When a coach lost his mind on camera, you're hearing the quote. When a federation tried to appeal a ban and got slapped down, you're finding out why. And when an entire nation got frozen out of the World Cup for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with football, we're going to explain the politics behind it in a way that actually makes sense. One more thing before we start, because a lot of you are going to be surprised by this. A player you love, maybe your favorite midfielder, maybe a guy on your fantasy team, maybe a legend you grew up idolizing, is going to show up on this list. And when he does, we're not sugarcoating it. Because the whole point of this video is to be honest about what the modern World Cup actually looks like. It's a stage where one wrong sentence, one late tackle, one supplement bottle, one covered mouth, and your entire dream evaporates in real time, in front of billions of people. This channel has analyzed every major disciplinary case connected to the tournament. We've read the FIFA rulings. We've cross-checked the appeals. We've watched the incidents frame by frame. And what we found is that this World Cup has already produced more career-defining bans in a shorter window than any tournament since the modern era began. So sit tight, get comfortable, because we're starting with the case that arguably rattled FIFA more than any other. A 20-year-old kid from Argentina. One whispered word. A jersey pulled up over his mouth, and a punishment so unusual it personally rewrote the rulebook for every player who came after him. His name is Gianluca Prestianni, and his story is where this whole thing begins. Gianluca Prestianni, 20 years old, left winger for Benfica, and, until February of the 25-26 season, one of the most exciting attacking prospects in the entire South American pipeline. Lionel Scaloni's coaching staff had been tracking him for months. Argentine media had been building him up as the next generational number 10, waiting behind the Messi era. The kid was electric. Quick feet, low center of gravity, unafraid of physical duels, the kind of profile that Argentina had been trying to develop for years. And with a home continent World Cup on the horizon, everyone in Buenos Aires quietly assumed the same thing. Prestianni was going to the United States. Prestianni was going to share a dressing room with Lionel Messi. Prestianni was one squad announcement away from becoming a household name. Then came the Champions League. Playoff round. First leg. Benfica versus Real Madrid. The The kind of stage that either launches a young player into the stratosphere or exposes him under a spotlight he was not ready for. Prestianni started the match. He was aggressive from the first whistle. And somewhere in the middle of a physical, high-tempo European night, he ended up in a face-to-face confrontation with a player who does not walk away from confrontations. Vinícius Jr., Real Madrid's Brazilian star, the most vocal victim of racial abuse in the modern game. A player who has spent years fighting for stricter punishment of on-field discrimination inside European football. If you were writing the script for the worst possible opponent to insult, you would write his name. According to the account given by Vinícius immediately after the whistle, Prestianni leaned in and used the Spanish word for monkey. And here is where the story takes the turn that would later reshape a FIFA rulebook. Prestianni did not say it openly. He said it while pulling the red Benfica jersey up over his lower face, covering his mouth, muffling the audio, blocking any camera angle that would allow a lip reader to reconstruct the phrase. This was not an accident. This was not a nervous tic. This was a deliberate concealment, done in a professional match, in front of dozens of high-definition television cameras, by a player who clearly understood exactly what he was doing and exactly why he was doing it. And the moment Vinícius saw it, he went straight to the fourth official. Real Madrid did not wait. Their entire bench mobilized in defense of their player. Vinícius filed a formal complaint on the spot. Within 24 hours, the club had submitted a written protest to UEFA. Within 48 hours, the story was on the front page of every major sports outlet in Europe. Marca, AS, L'Equipe, The Guardian, all running the same headline. Vinícius accuses Benfica winger of racial slur. And here is the direct quote from the initial statement attributed to Vinícius that circulated across multiple outlets that week. He said the phrase was clear, he said the intent was clear, and he said the fact that Prestianni chose to hide his mouth proved that the player knew exactly what he had done was punishable. UEFA opened a formal investigation. They pulled every camera angle from the broadcast. They interviewed players from both benches. They reviewed the audio channels that had not been muted for the television feed. And this is the part of the story that most fans never fully absorbed because it changes everything about how this ban unfolded. UEFA could not prove the racial insult, not because the accusation was weak, but because the concealment worked. The jersey blocked the visual, the stadium noise blocked the audio, and without direct forensic confirmation of the exact word, the racial abuse charge could not be formally sustained under the disciplinary code. However, and this is where Prestianni's own defense collapsed on him. In his written response to UEFA, Prestianni denied the racial slur but admitted that he had used a homophobic slur during the exchange. He put that admission in writing himself. UEFA now had a confession of discriminatory language on the record. Not the accusation Vinícius had made, but a different form of discriminatory conduct that the player himself had documented. The committee did what any disciplinary committee would do with a written admission in front of it. They sanctioned him for it. 6 matches. Discriminatory conduct. Effective immediately across all UEFA competitions. And that, in theory, was where the story was supposed to end. A European ban for a European incident handed down by the European Federation. But it did not end there. Because while UEFA was closing its file, a much bigger federation, sitting in a much bigger office, in the middle of a much bigger tournament cycle, had just started reading it. And what FIFA decided to do next is what turned a Champions League scandal into a World Cup extinction event. Here is a rule that most football fans have never had to think about because it almost never gets triggered. When UEFA hands down a disciplinary sanction for discriminatory conduct, the ruling is limited to UEFA competitions. Champions League, Europa League, Conference League, Nations League. That is the jurisdiction. It ends at the edge of European club and national competition. It does not automatically travel with the player into other tournaments, other continents, other federations. In 99% of cases, that is where a sanction stops. A player serves the ban, he moves on with his life, and by the time the next World Cup rolls around, nobody in the FIFA offices in Zurich has any interest in reopening a closed European file. The Prestianni case was not the 99%. FIFA looked at the ruling. FIFA looked at the specifics. FIFA looked at the fact that the offense was on the record, admitted in writing, sanctioned formally, and connected to a player who was on the shortlist of the reigning world champions. And FIFA made a decision that shocked half the Argentine football community. They extended the sanction globally, meaning the punishment would follow Prestianni into the World Cup itself. 2 matches of the 2026 FIFA World Cup if he was named to the Argentina squad, would be automatically wiped off his eligibility. Not a warning, not a reprimand. A hard 2-game suspension, applied on top of the European sanction coordinated across federations and issued in writing. The Argentine Football Association did not accept that quietly. They filed a formal appeal to reduce the suspension. They argued that the offense had already been punished at the club level. They argued that FIFA's extension amounted to double punishment, and the appeal was rejected. Not softened, not partially reduced. Rejected. Sources close to the AFA later told Argentine media that the federation had explored one final legal avenue, an emergency injunction that would have allowed Prestianni to defer the ban until after the World Cup, meaning he could have played the tournament, taken the ban later, served it during a friendly window. That was the plan, and that plan died on the calendar. The window for filing the injunction closed before the paperwork could be completed. Time simply ran out. That is when Lionel Scaloni had to make one of the hardest phone calls of his coaching career. Argentina are the defending world champions. Argentina are one of the favorites to lift the trophy again. The squad list is not a wish list. Every attacking spot on that roster is contested by world-class competition. And Scaloni, when he sat down with his staff to finalize the 26-man list, had to weigh a simple question. Do we bring a player who cannot participate in a third of the group stage, cannot be counted on for the opener, and comes attached to a diplomatic headache the moment the Brazilian Federation is asked to comment on it? The answer was no. Prestianni was not on the plane. His name did not appear on the final list published by the AFA. His World Cup, at 20 years old, was over before it started. And here is the part of this story that Argentine media has kept quietly circling for weeks. This was not a fringe hopeful being cut. This was a player Scaloni had personally identified as part of the next generation. This was a player who had trained with the senior squad. This was a player whose international debut had already been penciled in for a friendly window that never happened. He was inside the circle. He was inside the room. And the door closed on him because of one whispered exchange on one European night that he tried to hide behind a piece of red cloth pulled over his own mouth. Now, before we move on to the next case, quick pause. If you are getting value from this breakdown, if you want more stories like this one told the same way, no filler, no recycled press release, just the actual mechanics of what happened, do the channel a favor and hit the like button. Costs you nothing. Helps this video reach every other football fan who's trying to make sense of this World Cup and is genuinely the single most helpful thing you can do while you're watching. Alright, back to the cases. Because the next name on the list is a very different kind of story. Not a scandal that took months to unfold. Not a European incident that traveled across federations. This one happened live on the opening weekend of the tournament in front of a stadium packed to the ceiling and a global television audience watching the first match of a co-host nation. The player is a 36-year-old veteran midfielder who is supposed to be the creative brain of an entire national team's World Cup campaign. Tebogo Mokoena of South Africa. And what happened to him at the Azteca Stadium in the 84th minute of a match that was already slipping away is one of the most brutal disciplinary sequences we have seen an opening round World Cup match in years. The opening match of a World Cup for any nation is a rare kind of moment, especially for a country like South Africa. Bafana had waited 16 years to walk into another World Cup group stage. 16 years. An entire generation of footballers born, raised, developed, and retired inside the gap between the 2010 home tournament and this one. And when the fixture list was released, and South Africa were paired against Mexico in the opening slot at the Azteca Stadium, in front of a hostile 90,000-seat cauldron, the entire South African football pyramid understood what was on the line. This was not an easy match. This was a survival match. And the man they needed most on the pitch was Tebogo Mokoena. Mokoena is the axis of that South Africa midfield. Mamelodi Sundowns pedigree. CAF Champions League experience. A defensive midfielder with a passing range broader than most of his continental peers. If Bafana were going to soak up pressure at the Azteca and then break out into transition against a Mexico team that presses in aggressive phases, Mokoena was the player who had to make it happen. He was the connector. He was the piece that turned defense into attack. He was the reason the coaching staff believed the game plan could survive at altitude. The match kicked off on June 11th, 2026. Wilton Sampaio, one of the most respected Brazilian referees on the FIFA international list, was in the middle. Mexico controlled the tempo from the opening whistle. South Africa absorbed. The score stayed goalless deeper into the first half than most neutral observers expected. Then the match tilted. South Africa lost a player to an earlier dismissal that reshaped the game inside out. Bafana were now defending with one player fewer at altitude against a Mexico side that smelled blood. Mokoena, already carrying a heavy defensive workload, was now carrying the weight of a broken structure on top of it. Mexico opened the scoring, then extended it. 2-0. The clock was bleeding out. And in the 84th minute of a match that South Africa had effectively already lost, Mokoena was involved in an off-the-ball incident with Mexican midfielder Roberto Alvarado. In real time, it looked like nothing. A brush of contact, a jostling of positioning, the kind of exchange that happens 20 times in every top-level match. Sampaio waved play on, but then the VAR booth in the tournament operations center intervened. A review, a monitor pitch side. Sampaio walked over. He looked at the footage, and he did something the South African bench had not seen coming. He gave Mokoena a straight red card. The ruling on the pitch was that Mokoena had used his arm as a weapon in the confrontation with Alvarado. Not a mistimed challenge, not a reckless swing. A deliberate arm to the head of a Mexican player, off the ball, in the 84th minute of a match South Africa had already conceded. Sampaio did not hesitate once the video review confirmed the contact. The card came out. Mokoena walked, and South Africa finished the match with 9 men on the pitch in the highest altitude stadium in world football, in front of a Mexican crowd celebrating every touch. The final whistle was almost a mercy. 2-0 on the scoreboard. 9 men on the field. A team that had waited 16 years to be here and now, walking off the Azteca pitch with the worst possible opening result. And Mokoena, sitting in the dressing room after the match, still had no idea that FIFA was about to make his situation much, much worse. Because the red card triggered an automatic one-match suspension under standard disciplinary procedure. That is baseline. Every red card at a World Cup carries that penalty. But FIFA's disciplinary committee reviewed the footage under a different framework. They classified the action not as serious foul play, but as violent conduct. And under the FIFA disciplinary code, violent conduct carries a minimum sanction of 3 matches. 3 matches in a group stage, where South Africa only had 3 matches total to begin with. Mokoena's tournament was effectively over before the second match day, and his head coach was about to walk into a press conference and tell the world exactly what he thought of the ruling. Hugo Broos is not a coach who bites his tongue. Belgian by birth, brutal by temperament, one of the very few managers on the African continent with an Africa Cup of Nations trophy already sitting on his shelf, Broos has built his reputation on being the exact opposite of a media diplomat. He says what he thinks. He challenges rulings on the record. And when the 2026 FIFA World Cup opened with his team losing its most important midfielder to a 3-match suspension in the first match of the tournament, he walked into that post-match press conference in Mexico City already loaded. His public statement was not a defense of Mokoena. That is the interesting part. Broos did not claim his player was innocent. He did not claim the arm did not connect. He did not attack the video review as a process. What Broos attacked was the calibration of the punishment. Speaking to reporters from a podium in the Azteca press room, Broos said the second red card of the match, the one Mokoena had received, was, in his own words, quote, too soft to give that as a red card, end quote. He accepted the referee's authority. He accepted the position of the officials. What he refused to accept was that the same level of contact on the same weekend of the tournament was being punished differently in other matches he had personally watched. And here is where the mold starts to bite, because this is not just one frustrated coach venting after a bad night. Broos was, without saying it directly, planting a flag on one of the most persistent complaints inside the FIFA disciplinary process: inconsistency. And to understand why that complaint matters, we have to zoom out. Every World Cup, going back years, produces the same pattern. 2 similar incidents occur in 2 different matches. One results in a straight red and a 3-match ban. The other results in a yellow or no card at all. Fans notice it in real time. Coaches whisper about it in tunnels. Analysts point out on television. And the FIFA committee, sitting in its meeting rooms, almost never explains publicly why the same physical action gets different sanctions in different matches. That is not a fan complaint. That is a structural complaint made by federation officials on the record in press releases going back multiple World Cups. Now, let us be genuinely fair for a second, because this is the moment in every one of these breakdowns where the honest answer matters more than the emotional one. FIFA has a defensible reason for the Mokoena verdict. The video review did show a deliberate arm motion off the ball in a moment where the ball was not near either player. That is textbook violent conduct under the disciplinary code. If you take the incident on its own, in isolation, the 3-match sanction is inside the letter of the rules. And Bruce knows that. He is not arguing the letter of the rules. He is arguing the pattern of application. Two things that, for a professional coach at a World Cup, are not the same thing. But once you extend that argument across the tournament, another problem shows up. Because the moment you accept that FIFA is applying the disciplinary code inconsistently, you also have to ask whether the biggest disciplinary story of this entire World Cup, the one we are about to move into right now, is another chapter of the exact same pattern. And that pattern, by the time we get to the end of this video, is going to look a lot less like isolated bad luck and a lot more like a federation that decided to enforce brand new rules mid-tournament without giving the players and the coaches a fair chance to adjust to them. Which brings us straight into the next case. Because if you thought Mokoena's 3-match ban for an arm to the head was aggressive, wait until you hear what happened to a Paraguayan attacking midfielder for saying something with his hand over his mouth. Not for what he said, for how he said it, not for the words, for the gesture. This is the case that put the new FIFA rule, the one we told you about in the Prestianni story, into live enforcement for the very first time. It is the case that split the disciplinary debate down the middle. And it involves a player who has spent his entire career being one of the most professional, disciplined, well-liked footballers in South America. Miguel Almirón, 32 years old, Paraguay national team captain material, former Newcastle United fan favorite, and the first player in World Cup history to be sent off in an official FIFA match under a rule that did not exist until a Champions League incident in February forced the sport to write it. To understand what happened to Miguel Almirón, you have to first understand the exact sequence of events that led to the rule he broke. Because the rule was not written in a vacuum. The rule was written in reaction. It was drafted in the weeks that followed the Prestianni incident, debated inside the offices of the International Football Association Board, and formally approved by football's global rulemaking body ahead of this exact tournament. And the language of the rule, once you read the actual text, is extraordinarily broad. Under the amendment approved by the IFAB, at the discretion of the competition organizer, any player covering their mouth in a confrontational situation with an opponent may be sanctioned with a red card. May, not shall. May, which means the decision is not automatic, is not mechanical, is not a computer flagging a violation. It is a human referee, in real time, deciding whether the way a player moved his hand or lifted his shirt in front of another player crossed the line into concealment. That is a lot of subjective weight to hand to a single referee. And the first time it was ever going to be tested, on the biggest stage in football, the whistle was going to belong to Ivan Barton, Salvadoran referee. FIFA international list. Assigned to Paraguay versus Turkey. Group D. The match Paraguay had circled on the calendar as the one that could realistically decide the second qualification, slot behind whichever heavyweight ended up topping the group. And Almirón, at 32 years old, was walking into that fixture as arguably the most experienced, most professionally polished attacking midfielder in the Paraguay squad. Newcastle United history. Premier League miles in his legs. A career built on being the exact opposite of a player who gets ejected from a match for a disciplinary infraction. The incident happened in first-half stoppage time. 3rd minute of the added period. Paraguay had already been chasing the game rhythmically. There had been a foul near midfield. Tempers were rising, the way they always rise late in the half of a tight international match, and Almirón exchanged words with Turkish defender Mert Mulder. That is where the sequence stops being an ordinary football argument and starts becoming a case study in how brand new rules interact with old football habits. As Almirón said something to Mulder, he lifted his hand toward his own face and covered his mouth. Mulder saw the gesture. Mulder knew exactly what had just been implemented by FIFA weeks earlier. Mulder turned to Barton and appealed directly to the referee, gesturing at his own mouth to make the point unambiguous. This was not a tackle appeal. This was not a shirt pull appeal. This was a citation of the new rule. Barton did what a modern referee is required to do in that scenario. He walked to the pitch side monitor. He reviewed the footage. The video was clear. Almirón had covered his mouth during a confrontational exchange with an opponent. The angle showed it. The gesture was there in high definition. And under the exact language of the rule that had been approved months earlier because of a 20-year-old Argentine kid pulling his jersey up in a Champions League match, Barton had the discretion to send Almirón off. He used that discretion. He walked back to the field. He pulled out the red card. And Miguel Almirón became the first player in the recorded history of FIFA World Cup competition to be dismissed under the mouth cover regulation. Paraguay's response was chaos. The bench went vertical. The captains surrounded the referee. The Paraguayan Federation officials in the stands looked, on the broadcast feed, like people who had just watched a decades-long career unravel over a hand gesture. Because it was not just that Almirón had been ejected from this match. It was that the ejection carried an automatic one-match suspension, which meant Almirón was going to miss the final Paraguayan group stage match against Australia. A fixture Paraguay considered winnable. A fixture that could reasonably decide second place in Group D. And FIFA, under the same disciplinary framework we already discussed with Mokoena, retained the discretion to extend that suspension if the committee reviewed the incident and decided a heavier sanction was warranted. Meaning even a potential knockout round match was suddenly at risk for a player who might never see another World Cup at his age. And here is the detail that most casual viewers of that match never picked up on. This was not the first time Almirón had been carded under a new rule during this exact tournament. There was already an earlier incident against the United States. And when that earlier ruling is added to the eviction against Turkey, the picture of what is happening to this player and to this Paraguay squad becomes very hard to defend as coincidence. Rewind 8 days. Paraguay versus the United States. Group D opener. A match that co-host nation had entered under enormous domestic pressure, and Paraguay had entered as the tactical underdog. Almirón started. He played the professional, disciplined, high work rate 90 minutes that anyone who followed his Newcastle years would have recognized. But somewhere in the second half of that match, another new mechanism of FIFA officiating quietly interfered with his tournament. Here is what happened. During a phase of play, the American captain Tim Ream received an initial yellow card from the referee for a challenge involving Almirón. The card had already been shown. The name was already in the notebook. This is the moment where, in every previous World Cup any of us have ever watched, the story would have ended. The card is issued. Play continues. Everybody moves on. But the 2026 FIFA World Cup is not running under that framework anymore. The video assistant referee reviewed the sequence. And after the review, the ruling was reversed in a way that most fans watching live had never seen before. The yellow card was not just cancelled, it was reassigned. Tim Ream's yellow was wiped from the record, and Miguel Almirón, on the same play, was retroactively given the yellow card himself. The reason given by the officiating team, according to the FIFA match report, was simulation. In plain language, diving. Take a moment to sit with that. A player who was fouled had the foul erased from the record, and the same player was then cautioned for simulating a foul that the referee, in real time, had originally believed was real. That kind of double inversion of a decision has almost no precedent in top-level international football. It exists in the letter of the VAR protocol and in the letter of the video review manual, but is functionally almost never triggered. And the first time it was triggered in a live World Cup match, the player on the receiving end of that inversion was the same player who, 8 days later, would become the first man in tournament history sent off for covering his mouth in an argument. Same player, same tournament. Two brand new mechanisms of FIFA enforcement, both used against him, both on national television. His own coach, Gustavo Alfaro, walked into the press conference after the Turkey match with the composure of a man who has already accepted that arguing was useless. Alfaro's quote to reporters was as direct as any statement in this entire tournament. He said, quote, "According to the law, if you cover your mouth, you're sent off. Red card. There's nothing I can do about that. Unfortunately, we can't issue a new opinion on this." End quote. Read that carefully. That is not a coach defending his player. That is not a coach attacking the referee. That is a coach admitting, on the record, that the rule is written in a way that leaves him nothing to argue. He is not appealing. He is not complaining. He is stating that under this new framework, the discussion is already over before it starts. Almirón is out. And that is the piece of the story that connects it back to the Prestianni case in a way most viewers never fully assemble. Almirón did not just get himself ejected from a World Cup match. Almirón became, in real time, the walking demonstration of what happens when a federation writes a rule in reaction to one incident and then hands that rule to referees who now have to enforce it consistently across every match of a global tournament. The concealment rule was written to punish racial abuse being hidden behind clothing. That was its stated purpose. That was the FIFA press release. That was the intent. And the first player it caught was a Paraguayan international who nobody, including the Turkish Federation, has publicly accused of racial abuse of any kind. He was ejected for the gesture. not for the content of what he said, just for the gesture. Whether that is a defensible enforcement of the rule or an overreach that will need to be recalibrated in future tournaments is a debate FIFA is going to have to answer for. But sitting inside this World Cup in real time, with the group stage still unfolding, it is one of the biggest ongoing disciplinary stories of the tournament, and it is far from finished. Quick pause before we move on. If you have made it this far into the video, you already know we are not going to run out of cases. This channel is going to be tracking every one of these disciplinary stories as they develop through the knockout rounds, every appeal, every new ruling, every squad reshuffle that comes out of a suspension. If you want that coverage as it drops, hit the subscribe button and turn the bell on. It is the single easiest way to make sure you do not miss the next chapter of this exact story. Because the next case on our list is not a scandal and is not a controversy. It is a genuine tragedy in the middle of a match involving a challenge nobody, not even the player who made it, believed was going to end the way it did. June 18th, 2026. Vancouver. Group stage match between Canada and Qatar in front of a home crowd that had been waiting for this fixture on the calendar since the day Canada were confirmed as a co-host. Canada's tournament had already been building momentum. Qatar's tournament had already been unraveling. And what was supposed to be a high-tempo showcase match for the Canadian side turned into one of the most difficult scenes of the entire group stage. Because in the middle of a game Canada were dominating on the scoreboard, one of their own players suffered an injury that, in slow-motion replay, made everyone in the stadium go completely silent. Ismaël Koné, 24 years old, Canadian midfielder, a player Canada had been building its future spine around for years. Koné was on the ball, in a central area, moving through a phase of play that looked, in real time, like nothing more than an ordinary midfield exchange. And that is the exact word every neutral observer in the broadcast booth used when the incident happened. Ordinary. Madibo, the Qatari midfielder covering that zone, put in what looked, at full speed, like a completely innocuous challenge. There was no lunge. There was no dangerous swing. There was no crunching two-footed contact that any experienced fan would have flagged instantly. The referee reached for his pocket and gave Madibo a yellow card, moved on, and the match kept flowing. Then the medical staff got to Koné, and everyone in the stadium started to understand that something was very wrong. Koné was on the ground. He was not getting up. He was not trying to get up. Canadian teammates were waving frantically toward the sideline. Qatari players were standing away from the scene, hands on their heads, refusing to look. And within seconds, the broadcast cut to a slow-motion replay that told an entirely different story from the one the referee had seen in real time. At full speed, the challenge looked routine. At slow speed, the mechanics of what actually happened became visible. Koné had planted his standing foot on the ground at the exact angle that made the leg vulnerable. Madibo's contact was not a first-action tackle. It was a secondary motion, a follow-through, a moment of contact that arrived a fraction of a second after the ball was gone. And when that follow-through connected with a leg that had no give in it, the result was catastrophic. Koné had suffered a broken leg, confirmed later by the Canadian Federation medical staff. On the biggest stage of his career, on a challenge his opponent would have given anything to take back. The VAR intervened. Sitting in the Tournament Operations Center, the video review team went back to the sequence and upgraded the sanction. Madibo's yellow card was pulled. A red card was issued. Not because the review team believed Madibo had intended to injure Koné, but because the reckless nature of the follow-through, combined with the severity of the injury it produced, met the threshold for serious foul play under the FIFA disciplinary code. Madibo, walking off the pitch, had his hands on his head the entire way. Distressed is not a strong enough word for what the broadcast captured. He was inconsolable, and Qatar's night was already worse than the scoreline suggested, because Madibo's red card was not the first of the match for the Qatari side. Homam Ahmed had been dismissed earlier in the 33rd minute of the first half, meaning Qatar were now finishing the fixture with 9 men on the pitch against a Canada side that sent it a rout in front of a Vancouver crowd that had been building throughout the evening. The final score, 6-0 in favor of Canada, was one of the most lopsided defeats of the entire group stage. A humiliation that was going to define the Qatari tournament regardless of how the remaining fixtures played out. Then came the disciplinary aftermath. FIFA's committee reviewed the challenge. They accepted on the record that there was no evidence of malicious intent from Madibo. There was no accusation of dirty play. There was no citation for violent conduct. What there was in the language of the disciplinary code was a challenge that qualified as rough and serious play, and the minimum sanction for rough and serious play is a 2-match suspension. which means Madibo, already carrying the automatic one-match ban from the red card, was now sidelined for a group stage fixture Qatar had considered central to their survival. Bosnia and Herzegovina, a team Qatar had genuinely believed they could get a result against. And now that fixture was going to be played without their midfield anchor. There's no villain in this story. There is no scandal to unpack. Madibo was not carrying a bad reputation into the challenge. He was not a repeat offender. He was a professional footballer at a World Cup who mistimed one movement by one fraction of a second in a match his team had already lost, and who is now going to spend the rest of his career carrying the memory of what happened to Ismaël Koné on the other end of that follow-through. The World Cup does not give players their moments back. Neither does the FIFA Disciplinary Committee. For 22 years, Cristiano Ronaldo had done something no other footballer in the modern history of the sport had done. 226 international appearances for Portugal. 226. That is not a highlight reel number. That is not a marketing statistic. That is a hard, verifiable record on the FIFA books, and until November of 2025, it came attached to another record that mattered even more inside a dressing room. 0 red cards. In every single senior international match Ronaldo had ever played for the Portuguese national team, across 4 World Cups, across 7 European Championships, across every friendly and qualifier in between, he had never once been dismissed. Not one time. 226 matches on the record. 0 direct expulsions. That is a discipline record that in the modern era has no serious competitor. Then came the qualifier in Dublin. Portugal versus the Republic of Ireland. A fixture Portugal had already essentially secured a favorable position in the group standings for, but a fixture the Irish had made physical from the first whistle. Ireland were pressing high, competing for every second ball, and doing exactly what a smaller footballing nation is supposed to do to a giant on home soil. And in the 61st minute, the frustration that had been building inside the Portuguese captain broke out, on camera, in the middle of a physical duel. Ronaldo went up for a ball against Ireland defender Dar O'Shea. He did not just contest the header. He led with his elbow off the ball and made contact with O'Shea's face at the exact moment the two were disengaging from each other. It was not a tackle. It was not part of a challenge for possession. It was a swinging elbow in an off-the-ball moment on a defender who had been physically shadowing him for most of the match. The referee initially reached for a yellow card. That was the on-pitch decision. But the VAR team, sitting in the operations center, immediately intervened. A review was requested. The referee walked to the pitch side monitor. He watched the replay. He watched it again. And when he came back to the field, he upgraded the sanction. Not a yellow, a straight red card. Violent conduct. Ronaldo, staring at the referee in something close to disbelief, walked off the pitch as the 226 match discipline record ended in a single motion of his own arm. Historic. First red card of his Portugal career. And the first red card he had ever received in a World Cup qualifying cycle heading into what everyone in Portugal understood was going to be his 6th and final tournament. The immediate response from the opposing bench told you everything you needed to know about how the football world was going to frame the incident. Ireland head coach Heimir Hallgrímsson, walking into the post-match press conference, refused to give Ronaldo any diplomatic escape. His public statement was, quote, "He complimented me with putting pressure on the referee, but listen, it had nothing to do with me. It was his action on the pitch that cost him a red card. This was just a moment of a little silliness for him, I would say," end quote. Read that carefully. Hallgrímsson is not calling him a dirty player. He is not attacking his career. He is calling it silliness. And in the professional vocabulary of an international coach, silliness is a word you use when a player, at 40 years old, at the peak of his final World Cup cycle, has done something a 19-year-old amateur would know not to do. Then came the disciplinary process. FIFA's committee reviewed the incident. They classified it, unambiguously, as violent conduct. Standard sanction for violent conduct under the FIFA code is a 3-match suspension, which would have meant Ronaldo missing Portugal's opening match of the World Cup, second match, and third match, the entire group stage. That is not a small punishment for a player who has been publicly stating for years that this tournament is his last stage. And then something remarkable happened inside the ruling. FIFA published the disciplinary verdict, and it did not read the way most people had expected it to read. The committee imposed the 3-match ban, but they deferred 2 of those 3 matches. Deferred, in disciplinary language, means suspended on condition. 2 of the 3 matches were placed under a 1-year probationary period, meaning they would only be activated if Ronaldo committed another infraction of similar nature and gravity inside that same window. So the mandatory active portion of the sanction was 1 match. And Ronaldo served that 1 match in Portugal's final qualifying fixture, a comfortable win over Armenia that sealed the Portuguese place in the 2026 World Cup. Meaning by the time the tournament kicked off, the captain was clean, eligible, and available for every group stage match Portugal were going to play. Escape. Almost complete escape. But not full escape, because that probation clause is still active, is still on the record. And if Cristiano Ronaldo commits another infringement of a similar nature and gravity at any point during the 2026 FIFA World Cup, the remaining 2 matches of that suspension are activated on the spot, and the greatest goal scorer in the history of men's international football watches the rest of his final tournament from a hotel room. At 41 years old, that is not a risk anyone in the Portuguese Federation is willing to take lightly. Paul Pogba's story is not a red card story, is not an on-pitch scandal, is not a viral incident that turned into a headline. Paul Pogba's story is what happens when a career that once sat at the very top of world football walks into a room, sits down for a routine post-match doping test, and discovers weeks later that everything the player has built for the last decade is about to be taken away in a single letter from a national anti-doping authority. This is the quiet kind of ban, the kind that arrives by email, and in the modern era, it has become the most dangerous kind of ban that a professional footballer can face. The date matters. August of 2023. Pogba was back at Juventus, having returned to the Italian club that had made him a global star before his Manchester United years, and he had just played a match against Udinese. Standard post-match doping procedure. Random selection. Sample submitted. Chain of custody sealed and shipped. And when the results came back, the sample had returned positive for DHEA. Dihydroepiandrosterone. A banned substance under the World Anti-Doping Agency prohibited list because of its ability to elevate testosterone levels in the human body. This is not a gray area substance. This is not a supplement that got flagged on a technicality. DHEA is on the list, has been on the list, and every professional athlete at the top level of any Olympic-recognized sport is drilled from a very young age to check every single thing they consume against that list. Pogba's defense, from the very first public statement, was consistent. He said the substance had entered his system inadvertently. He said it had come in through a nutritional supplement that he had personally believed was safe. He said he had never knowingly taken a banned substance in his professional career, and he pointed to the fact that his broader supplement stack, cross-checked by team medical staff, had not contained anything else that would have raised a red flag. That was the explanation. That was the defense. And when the case reached the Italian anti-doping authorities in February of 2024, the initial verdict landed like a hammer. For years. Not 1, not 2. For full years of suspension from all competitive football, at any level, in any federation. For a player who was 30 at the time of the ruling, for years is a career sentence. Do the math. A 4-year ban would have kept Pogba out of football until well past his 34th birthday, wiped out any realistic chance of representing France at another World Cup, ended his commercial relevance across the sponsorship market, and effectively closed the professional book on a footballer who had once been considered the most promising midfielder of his entire generation. Pogba's legal team appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. That is the last real avenue any suspended athlete has under the international disciplinary framework. And the CAS did something that surprised most observers. They reduced the ban, not by a token amount, substantially, from 4 years to 18 months, meaning Pogba would be eligible to make his return to competitive football in March of 2025. Monaco came in. The League One side offered the 2018 World Cup winner a 2-year contract, a professional structure to rebuild inside, and a public runway back to top-flight football. Pogba accepted, and at the moment he signed the deal, his public statement was as raw as any quote in this entire story. He said, quote, "Football isn't over for me. We've worked hard. We've waited more than 2 years to get back. And today it finally happened. Thank God," end quote. That was the framing. That was the arc redemption story, one final chapter, one last shot at the France squad, one last honest run at a World Cup. And then reality collapsed on him, because the comeback that Monaco had built the plan around never materialized. Pogba, over the entire end stretch of the season, played 57 minutes of League One football. 57 total, across 5 appearances. That is not a rotational role. That is not a slow reintegration into a squad. That is a body that has been asked to come back at 33 years old after 18 months of forced inactivity and has refused at almost every attempt to hold up under professional demands. Injuries stacked up. Match minutes evaporated, and the physical assessment leaking out of Monaco was, in the words of French sports media, savage. By the time the 2026 FIFA World Cup arrived on the calendar, Pogba was 33 years old, out of the France squad for years, and without the match rhythm any national team coach in Europe would need to justify a call-up. Didier Deschamps had already reshaped the French midfield around a new generation. There was no realistic path back. And Paul Pogba, the 2018 champion, watched this tournament from the same place millions of former players watch every World Cup they no longer belong to. A sofa, in front of screen, somewhere far away from the stage. Sandro Tonali's story is Paul Pogba's story with a different vice. Same shape, same collapse, different mechanism. Because where Pogba's suspension came from a bottle of supplements he says he did not know was dangerous, Tonali's suspension came from something he knew perfectly well was against the rules, and did anyway, over and over again, until the paper trail became long enough to end the biggest transfer of his life. Newcastle United signed Sandro Tonali in the summer of 2023 for £55 million. That is not a mid-tier signing. That is one of the most expensive Italian midfielders in the history of the modern transfer market. He was going to be the deep-lying spine of Eddie Howe's Champions League project, the tempo controller Newcastle had been trying to buy for years. The Italian international the Toon Army had already started printing shirts for. He played 8 Premier League matches. 8. Before the entire thing detonated. Italian investigators uncovered what he had actually been doing during his time at AC Milan. Tonali had been placing bets on football matches inside Italy. Matches involving his own club. Matches he himself had participated in. That is not a gray area of the sporting code. That is not a debatable enforcement question like the mouth cover rule. That is one of the most explicit prohibitions in the entire regulatory framework of professional football. Betting on your own competition at any level, in any league, is career-ending misconduct because it strikes at the foundation of what the sport is selling to the public. Tonali admitted it. The investigation confirmed it. And the Italian Federation, backed by FIFA's own gambling disciplinary framework, handed him a 10-month ban from all football activity. No matches, no training with his club, no involvement with the Italian national team, and critically, no participation in the 2024 European Championship, where Italy imploded in the group stage and could have desperately used the very midfielder who was sitting at home under sanction. His head coach at Newcastle, Eddie Howe, walked into a press conference and said something that has become one of the most humane quotes any Premier League manager has given about a player in crisis. Howe said, quote, "We will throw our arms around Sandro and protect him and try to give him the love and support he needs to find solutions to the problems he's had." End quote. Read that carefully. Howe is not talking about a bad tackle. He is talking about a gambling addiction. He is publicly acknowledging that his multi-million-pound signing has a problem that goes deeper than football discipline, and he is signaling to the entire industry that the club is going to treat it as a health issue as much as a sporting one. Tonali came back. He fought his way into competitive football. He worked his way back into the Italy squad. And by the time the 2026 FIFA World Cup arrived on the calendar, he was 24 years old and still, on paper, one of the most talented deep-lying midfielders of his generation. But the missing months are not something you get back. The development window that Tonali burned during his ban is a window that closes for every professional footballer, and it does not reopen just because the player is now eligible again. Every training session missed, every friendly cycle skipped, every tactical evolution he was not present for is a piece of ceiling that no return can restore. Now, if Tonali's case is the biggest personal disciplinary story of the tournament, the biggest collective one is not about a player at all. It is about an entire country. Russia is not at the 2026 FIFA World Cup. Not because a player crossed a line. Not because a coach abused a referee. Not because a federation failed a compliance audit. Russia is not at the World Cup because in 2022, following the invasion of Ukraine, both FIFA and UEFA suspended all Russian national and club teams from every international competition under their governance. That suspension has never been lifted. And when the UEFA qualification process for the 2026 tournament kicked off, Russia was not on the fixture list. Think about what that means for the actual footballers. Alexei Miranchuk, Anton Shunin, Artem Zayuba, a generation of professionals who had built their entire careers pointing toward this tournament, and who have been quietly, systematically, permanently removed from the map. Not through anything they personally did, not through a positive test or a violent conduct charge, through a geopolitical decision made in the offices of governing bodies that have exactly one lever available when a member federation's government starts a war. That lever is exclusion. And it has been pulled, and it has not been released, and there's no realistic mechanism inside the current international structure to bring Russia back into the qualification cycle until the underlying conflict is resolved. That is not one player watching from a sofa. That is a national team, a domestic pyramid, and a generation of Russian footballers, all of them absent from the biggest tournament of their careers, all at the same time, for reasons that have nothing to do with sport. Is the largest disciplinary shadow hanging over the entire 2026 World Cup, and it is the one nobody at FIFA has a comfortable answer for. Step back from every single one of these individual cases for a second, and something bigger starts to come into focus. Because when you stack Prestianni's cover mouth, Mokoena's arm at the Azteca, Almirón's ejection under a rule that did not exist 8 months ago, Madibo's follow-through on a broken leg, Ronaldo's elbow in Dublin, Pogba's supplement bottle, Tonali's betting slips, and an entire Russian Federation frozen out of the qualification cycle. What you are actually looking at is not a series of unrelated disciplinary stories. You're looking at a snapshot of what the modern World Cup has become. This is not the tournament your father remembers. This is not the tournament that ran on the honor system, on the referee's naked eye, on the assumption that what happened on the pitch was the only thing that mattered. This is a tournament governed by video review booths, by disciplinary committees sitting in Zurich office buildings, by rules that get rewritten mid-cycle in reaction to a Champions League incident, and by federations that have no problem cutting a 20-year-old prodigy from the reigning world champions if the paperwork does not close in time. And here is the honest part. Because this video is not going to pretend the situation is one-sided. Some of these bans are defensible, and some of them are not. The Mokoena verdict is inside the letter of the code, but Bruce is right about the pattern of inconsistency. The Prestianni ruling protected the integrity of what UEFA had already sanctioned, but the extension to the World Cup was aggressive by any historical standard. The Almirón ejection was executed exactly the way the rule was written, but the rule itself is going to need serious recalibration if FIFA does not want to spend the next tournament cycle explaining why a professional footballer got sent off for a hand gesture. The Madibo case has no villain and no obvious better outcome, but the 2-match extension on top of the automatic ban is going to feel harsh to any coach who watched the replay in slow motion. Pogba and Tonali both broke rules they knew were rules, and both are paying the price the sport has always said would extract for that behavior. Ronaldo got a warning shot at 41 years old that he cannot afford to ignore. And Russia is a case that everyone in football knows is going to be argued for years after this tournament ends. But the pattern that ties every one of these cases together is impossible to ignore once you see it. FIFA is enforcing more faster and harder than at any tournament in living memory. New red card rules written between qualification and kickoff. Global suspensions extended across federations. Betting bans that shape entire national squads before a ball is kicked. Doping cases that redraw the medal maps of 2 consecutive World Cups. And an entire nation absent from a qualification bracket for reasons that a sporting body has no comfortable framework to resolve. Whether you think this is a healthy evolution of a sport, a long overdue correction after decades of soft enforcement, or an overreach by a governing body that is drunk on its own regulatory power, is the question this video has been quietly building toward the entire time. So we want to hand it back to you now. Because the point of a channel like this one is not to tell you what to think. It is to lay out the cases, walk you through what actually happened, show you the pattern, and let you make your own call. Which of these bans do you think was the fairest? Which one do you think was the most brutal? Do you believe FIFA has finally started policing the modern World Cup the way it always should have been policed? Or do you believe the governing body has started writing rules faster than the referees can consistently enforce them? Do you think Prestianni deserved to lose a World Cup at 20 years old because of a Champions League incident? Or do you think the punishment was double-billed? Do you think Russia should ever be brought back into the qualification cycle while the underlying conflict is still active? Or do you think exclusion is the only legitimate response a sporting body has? Drop your answer in the comments. Be specific. We read them. Take a position. And before you close this video out, do the channel 3 quick favors that make all of this coverage possible. Hit the like button because it is the fastest way to tell the algorithm that other football fans need to see this breakdown too. Hit the subscribe button and ring the bell because we are tracking every single one of these cases as it develops through the knockout rounds, and there is no version of this tournament where the disciplinary stories stop before the final whistle. And leave a comment answering at least one of the questions we just asked, because those specific answers are how we decide which cases to go deeper on in the next video. The 2026 FIFA World Cup is the biggest tournament in the history of the sport. It is also, without question, the most policed one. And the players who forgot that walked into a disciplinary machine that does not care about their reputation, their age, their transfer fee, or their World Cup dreams. It only cares about the record. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.